I'm Sean Emerson. I'm president of ACT. Thank you all for being here tonight. Tonight we have Delegate Jared Solomon, who's on his way in. But before he gets here, I have a little bit of ACT business anyway. First, as we always do, let's start out with some introductions. So I'm Sean from Gaithersburg, ACT president. Let's just, I guess we can start with you, Jake, and just go down the line.
Hey, everyone.
Oh yeah, sorry, we're going to have a microphone to pass around.
Okay. Hey, everyone. Jake Goodman, ACT board member. Currently live in Rockville, but I switch between Rockville and Gaithersburg every few months, so love this county.
Yes. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Sean Robertson, also a board member. I live in Kensington.
Ben Ross, I'm chair of Maryland Transit Opportunities Coalition. Live in Bethesda.
I'm Sija Z, and I'm from Rockville. I live nearby North Bethesda.
I'm Chip Clemmer. I live in College Park.
Oh, I'm Jerry Dantis, and I live in Greenbelt.
Richard Hoy. I live in Bethesda, former ACT board member.
Ed Barron, Silver Spring.
Phil Ferolino, Silver Spring.
Oh, are we going this way? Tina Slater, live in Silver Spring, just off Wayne Avenue, and the Purple Line that's coming in 2027.
Don Slater, East Silver Spring.
Yeah.
Graham Reed, Silver Spring.
Kathy Jentz, Silver Spring and ACT staff, and coming to.
Hello, I'm Tim Goodfellow. I live in Gaithersburg, and I'm also a member of the TAME Coalition, Transit Alternatives to the Mid-County Highway Extended.
Thank you, Ben. Cool. Thanks, everyone. We also have a great staffer, Lev Boone, in here running the technology. Everybody. Great. Hello, Delegate. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Let's do some quick intros real quick. Before we get to Delegate Solomon, just one more piece of ACT business. We have a board vacancy, as discussed at last month's meeting, because we had a little bit of shifting within the board. Some people, shifted to new positions, and I'm really happy to hear that GGG is willing to take that vacancy as a general board member. And he doesn't have a speech or anything, but he doesn't need one because, as far as I know, he's unchallenged. But if anyone else wants to be on the board, please raise your hand right now. Otherwise, looks like we're having an uncontested election. All right, thank you. So we can take a vote. If everyone, any ACT member is eligible to vote. So if you're an ACT member, paid up on your dues, you can vote. So all in favor of adding CGG to the board, please raise your hand. And that's a unanimous among the voting members. So thank you all. Congrats. Welcome aboard. Great. All right, so tonight we have Delegate Jared Solomon, who just walked in. He's a state delegate from District 18, got elected in 2018. Represents Chevy Chase, Wheaton, some parts of Silver Spring, Littonsville kind of area, basically western Georgia kind of, right? Been in the Assembly, I guess you just finished your 6th session, I believe. Yeah, so congrats. As of yesterday, signing day was last night at midnight, so we appreciate him being here, maybe on a little bit of a low sleep, so thank you for coming out. He's on the Appropriations Committee. I believe are you the Deputy Majority Whip? Or Deputy Speaker Pro Tem, right? Congrats on that. Yeah, it's a good title. I know you're also involved in many caucuses. Of most interest to this group is he's on the Maryland Transit Caucus. He joined once he got in. That's a group that was formerly known as Metro Work Group. It evolved to cover all transit in Maryland. He's been a great, steadfast supporter of policies that ACT supports over the years since he's been in office. Really happy to have him here tonight to give us a rundown of how the session went. So, Delegate Solomon, thank you. Take it away. Thank you.
There we go. We unmuted. Perfect. All right. Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see a great crowd here. And yeah, I will echo Sean's sentiment. So we ended, Sine Die was yesterday or first thing this morning at a little past midnight. So you'll apologize if I'm a little bleary-eyed. Haven't seen my family in a couple of days. It's always sort of a sprint towards the end this year in particular. So I spent a good chunk of the afternoon getting all the documents together. Obviously a big part of this session, which I'm going to talk about, was the budget. We didn't reach an agreement on the budget until, that's on wheels. We didn't reach an agreement on the budget with the Senate until late last week, which, as far as I've been there in my 6 sessions, that's the latest we've ever gone. We statutorily have to pass the budget by the 83rd day, or we have to extend the session. Thankfully, we did not go into extra time past Tiny Die, but the reason I mentioned that is really contentious. It was probably, absent maybe a handful of policy issues, the most important sort of global issue that we faced in the General Assembly this session. And most importantly, a lot of what we did related to transportation funding has not yet sort of been like fully analyzed. So we know what it is, but I know, because I love being among nerds here, you know, those of you who read detailed fiscal notes on the bills or the impact statements, the fiscal note and the reprint of the BRFA, the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, which has sort of all of the legislative and tax changes that go along with the budget to make the budget work. Those haven't been printed yet or fully posted. So I kind of cobbled what I had together in the background. So Sean, again, appreciate the warm introduction. So I represent, my district is a little ways down the road, sort of the Connecticut Avenue corridor. So transit obviously is hugely important. I think we have 8 metro stations either directly in the district or in close proximity, like Silver Spring, technically not in the district, but you know, a half mile down the road. On the Red Line, we'll have a handful of, I think, 3 Purple Line stations in the district. We have a handful of MARC stations. The BRT, both on Veers Mill and on 355, are really integral to our districts. I used to live in Rock Creek Forest, so I would take the bus to the metro. I now live in Kensington, and you know, I'm able to walk to the MARC station, which is hugely important to our family, and part of the reason why we chose to settle here. And I used to be a regular metro commuter when I worked on Capitol Hill. Sean mentioned, really honored to serve as the Deputy Speaker Pro Tem. Fancy title, it means I'm like 4th in line technically to chair or convene the House if the Speaker, the Deputy Speaker, and the Ways and Means Chair are out. But more importantly, in all practical terms, it really just means, you know, sort of part of the Speaker's leadership team and able to kind of take the pulse of what's going on in our caucus and advise the Speaker and my colleagues in leadership and other positions on what we should be doing on these types of issues. Really glad to serve as the co-chair, the House co-chair of the Transit Caucus, which Sean mentioned was actually a brainchild of a also well-known transit advocate for Montgomery County named Mark Corman, who now serves as the Environment and Transportation Committee, but was one of the founding members with also another infamous delegate, now Comptroller Brooke Learman. And so we have continued that legacy. I co-chaired in the House with Karen Lewis Young, who's a senator from Frederick, and has been a steadfast champion of Mark. So I wanted to talk through kind of a couple of things. I want to kind of set the scene for the overall budget, and then I want to go through some of the policy changes that we did, because they're really sort of 2 separate buckets. You know, in terms of like significant policies related to transportation, in terms of actual legislation, was kind of a fairly limited session. Really, all the action was more on the budget. But there are a couple of really important bills that I do want to highlight. We did a lot on housing as well, which if we have a couple of minutes, I'll kind of go through some of the big ones, which I know are really important to this organization. But I want to kind of set the scene a little bit for the budget. So, you know, I'll take you back to, I guess, October, November last year. And we were all sort of starting to get, you know, inklings that things were not going to be great, right? We were looking at revenue projections that weren't coming in where we thought they would. We knew based on the Transportation Trust Fund, sort of like long-term planning, that we may be a little short. And so come the beginning of December, right after the Thanksgiving holiday, the governor and the Maryland Department of Transportation kind of drop a bomb on us. And that bomb is a $3.3 billion shortfall between the capital side of the budget and the operating side of the budget. And this is just on transportation. As I think most of you know, the transportation budget and the trust fund are a separate budget from the sort of general operating fund that the state funds pretty much everything else, education, healthcare. And so in an ideal world, the transportation trust fund, which gets its money primarily from things like the gas tax and, you know, car registration fees and a whole bunch of other fees, is supposed to theoretically fund our roads, bridges, and transit for the most part. And for the last, I would say, decade or so, that hasn't really necessarily been the case. We've been dipping into the general fund to subsidize the trust fund. Hogan was sort of infamous for that. And again, you know, I know some of you know this even better than I do in the years that you've been tracking this. And so we get this bomb dropped on us from the governor. You know, again, we kind of had some inklings. We knew it wasn't going to be great, but I don't think anybody knew it was going to be quite that bad. And the way that the governor and the Department of Transportation say that we're going to balance the budget is basically with deep cuts. There's going to be a number of cuts on the operating side on things that, you know, we've come to know and love, like Mark Rail, like the commuter buses that are across the state, things like the locally operated transit systems, which are grants that go to literally each county in the state. For us in Montgomery County, that pays for a pretty sizable chunk of our ride-on bus. Significant cuts to highway user revenue fees, which go sort of a state supplement to local jurisdictions to be able to pay for road maintenance and sidewalks. And, you know, even though we think of it as roads, it's a lot of pedestrian safety upgrades and improvements that make the roads safer for all of us. And it was pretty bad. And then on the capital side, it literally cuts every capital expansion project from every jurisdiction except maybe a handful that are, you could argue, shovel ready. And, you know, again, by way of example, obviously we could talk about all the capital expenses that go into, you know, essentially the two transit systems that Maryland is responsible for in some ways managing. Obviously the MTA, the Maryland Transit Administration, which is buses, trains, and light rail in the Baltimore City area, plus obviously the MARC rail system. And then, you know, Maryland is a third or a quarter, if you count the federal government, of the management and funding for the metro system. And we're sort of unique in that way that the Maryland Department of Transportation essentially runs two almost wholly separate transit systems. And so in addition to the capital cuts on the transit side of things, there were also significant cuts to highway, road, and bridge projects across the state. And again, those projects, while obviously beneficial to cars, benefit all of us. And I'll give you Montgomery Hills as an example, which I know some of you have been advocating for a long time. And literally I started working on even before I was elected. You know, we've made huge progress in that. That is a project that will not only make the roads safer for cars, but will dramatically improve the pedestrian access to, you know, both sides of Georgia Avenue, to the two Purple Line stations that are going to be on both sides. You know, create dedicated bike paths. You know, literally create a whole new park for the county to control. So when we think of road projects, they're not always just for cars. They're beneficial in a whole host of things. And again, you know, what we sort of heard from MDOT was, we have a 6-year capital budget. We have an over $2.2 billion shortfall. We got to figure out how to do this. Go. And this is all against the backdrop of, again, we kind of knew things weren't going to be great. And so at the end of last session, so this time last year, we created the aptly named Train Commission, which is essentially a blue ribbon commission that the legislature, that we in the General Assembly put forward with the governor, that essentially brought forth like 30 or 40 folks from every walk of life that has anything to do with transportation to come up with, how do we look at our trust fund? We know it's not providing the kind of revenue that we need, and where do we get these revenues? What are the things we need to do? Do we need to, you know, move to a vehicles mile travel system? Do we need to put a fee on electric vehicles? How do we figure out a way to move away from just a simple gas tax? Because between hybrid and electric vehicles and the fact that cars are dramatically more fuel efficient, which is a great thing, than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago, they're just not, the trust fund is just not getting the revenue it needs from a gas tax. And that's playing out across the country, not just in Maryland, and even at the federal level, where I think the gas tax brings in, like, forget the exact percentage, but it is a small amount compared to what it used to decades ago. And so that's sort of the backdrop. The commission put out an interim report that touched on things like tolls and the fact that just the cuts that Larry Hogan made in tolls. I think most of you will remember, not only did Larry Hogan not increase tolls, he actually cut them. I think his second or third year in office in 2015, 2016, just that cut alone in the tolls, not even thinking about keeping them adjusted to inflation or the cost of transportation, caused an over $500 million hole in the trust fund. And I will say, you know, what I think for many of us was particularly frustrating and sort of this Teflon Larry Hogan that we often have to deal with. You know, he's tweeting and posting all these things like, oh, look, Democrats have been in control for a year. I left with a big surplus. You flushed it all down the toilet. You know, you've wasted it. Well, we got here primarily, or certainly a significant cause of it, was because of Larry Hogan. So I mentioned the tolls and the $500 million shortfall that we had. Obviously, I would imagine most of you in this room are pretty well aware of the tremendous cost overruns of the Purple Line, which, you know, again, that's fully on Larry Hogan's watch. You know, he came in and decided to blow up the whole system. His Department of Transportation grossly mismanaged the contract. And so we're looking at huge cost overruns. I mean, literally, I think like a doubling almost of the cost of the project. He committed us to additional expenses with the Frederick Douglass Tunnel, which is good, but again, he committed us to things and then left. And the Frederick Douglass Tunnel is the new B&P tunnel that runs under Baltimore for Amtrak. And so he committed, the tunnel's been renamed, and he committed us to a partnership with Amtrak, which again is a good thing, but costs money. And what he didn't do was provide any idea on how to pay for it. So that was sort of the backdrop that we enter into the legislative session of like, oh my God, we have to fix this, right? This isn't just an academic exercise of, we can move some money around here and we'll be all right. This is significant real world impacts to all of our communities, to literally every jurisdiction, big, small, rural, urban, red, blue, and purple across the state. And that was what we embarked onto, when we got back early in January. And so the House in particular, we launched into a full force. And so in addition to serving on the Speaker's leadership team and my role in the Transit Caucus, I also serve on the Transportation and Environment Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. And I've been really lucky. I've served on appropriations for my entire time in the legislature. And so our committee was really obviously at the forefront of fixing the budget, and our subcommittee was really at the epicenter of, all right, how do we hold MDOT accountable? How do we really get to the bottom of this? What's our strategy going to be? And it was a fascinating session, really, to dig into things. And I have to say, I was really proud of what we did in the House. Not to disparage our Senate colleagues, but we always, what is it? The enemy is not the opposing party; it's the chamber across the hall. Is the famous quote from Lyndon Johnson. So I think that the Senate sort of embarked on things with kind of nibble around the edge mindset. Very early on, the Senate President Ferguson said, "I do not want to raise taxes." The governor, from the very beginning, has sort of said, "I don't really want to raise taxes, or if we do, the bar has to be really high. You have to prove to me, that these are going to be really dramatic cuts." Right? I see. And I will say, taking a step back, I think one of the things that frustrated many of us, and I will say certainly frustrated me in December, was, the governor often talks about his number one priority, or one of his top priorities, is economic growth for the state. That, he knows that our budget is not sustainable the way it is right now. Again, we didn't talk about taxes basically for 10 years while Larry Hogan was governor. And our state looks very different today than it did a decade ago, when we last had this kind of conversation. And I like to call this my sort of "we need to eat our vegetables" speech, and I've been giving it since November. That roads, bridges, transit, schools, libraries, the things that we love in our community, parks, they're not free. That's what our tax dollars go for. And frankly, I would much rather live in Maryland than many other places in the country, but those things don't come free. And that's kind of the responsibility and the shared responsibility that we all have as taxpayers and members of the community. But for the governor to go around and say, economic development is my number one priority, it didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me that the headlines coming out, leading up to session was governor cuts $3.3 billion from transportation funding. As my colleague, the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Ben Barnes, really started to say during session, it's hard to find somebody that wants to invest in the state that does not want to invest in itself. And I'll give you one example. Yeah, he's a prophetic man. Shortly before the transportation budget came out, I went up to Trade Point Atlantic, which is the old Bethlehem Steel site just outside of Baltimore. Obviously, more in the news these days with the Key Bridge collapse. But Trade Point Atlantic has been, an unbelievable story of economic growth. It's gone from essentially a decrepit industrial wasteland that used to be the former steel facility to a headquarters for a number of companies, to the epicenter of sort of logistics and shipping. In that part of Baltimore, it's brought in 30,000 jobs. There's a whole nother deep water port there that is addition to the port of Baltimore, and it's really incredible. If you get an opportunity to even just drive through it, it's amazing. And so I sat down with. It's also, this is a little bit in flux, but it's also the location where the wind companies, Ørsted and U.S. Wind, were supposed to be building the new turbines that are still in flux for reasons beyond Maryland's control. But so I went up to meet with their team, and one of the cool things they were talking about was how they have been able to use transit, working with Baltimore County and MTA, to really tap into a whole new untapped set of workers and really dramatically impact unemployment rates in the surrounding communities. And they showed a really cool map that was overlaid with a couple of new transit routes that they got that showed, lo and behold, suddenly when they got a bus line or a new transit route, suddenly they were able to pull a whole new set of workers from those lines. And so they were really excited at that point because there was a bus route that went into Trade Point Atlantic that MTA was funding. But, Trade Point Atlantic is 5 it's a gigantic space. And so the bus route takes like literally 40 minutes to just complete its loop through the facility. I mean, it's huge. It's like acres after acres after acres. And so MTA was going to cancel that bus route, but Baltimore County was going to fund through their locally operated transit system program. They were going to fund essentially like a local connector that was just going to run through Trade Point Atlantic. So you get to Trade Point Atlantic, you get on the shuttle, and it would essentially take you through the spaces. And then they were going to take the money that MTA used to spend on that and create a new bus route to another part of Baltimore County that MTA would fund. And they were really excited because it would be dedicated transportation within Trade Point Atlantic and a new route to be able to pull new jobs. Well, about a week after I came, that got canceled because of all those cuts in the budget. So it was sort of one of these like, well, you have literally a new economic engine for the Baltimore region that is hugely interested in expansion of transportation, and you've just cut it. So again, didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. So that was kind of the lens that we came into the session with, guns blazing. That the House, we were going to fix this. We weren't going to bury our heads in the sand. We weren't going to kick the can down the road, which actually one of my Republican colleagues who represents the area, actually not far from Trade Point Atlantic, Rick Metzger, often said, and was one of the few Republicans actually that voted for our revenue increase package. And he serves on my subcommittee and really dedicated himself to understanding these issues, and took somewhat of a political risky vote for him to be able to do this, and made our package bipartisan. So we go through session. The governor gives us a little bit of an olive branch early on, but again, it's sort of a, how do we put a Band-Aid over a gaping hole in your foundation, or spackling over the cracks. He took $150 million out of the transportation, or out of the rainy day fund, and put it into transportation, sort of fix some of the one-time cuts. Not sustainable, doesn't provide us relief in any further years. And if you're Baltimore City or you're Montgomery County and you're trying to think about how do I fund the 5-year bridge replacement, or how do I fund a bus rapid transit line, that doesn't really help, but it does certainly stave off immediate cuts. It means we eminently reasonable. We put an additional fee on Uber and Lyft, or sort of ride sharing networks, of about it's 75 cents for sort of a generic combustion engine, a 50-cent fee on fuel cell or electric or hybrid vehicles, and then that gets pegged to inflation. There's two sets of things that we did. We did what ultimately passed, and then what we passed ourselves. We did the other thing that was sort of headline grabbing news was we raised the excise tax on vehicles. We raised the excise tax from 6% to 6.5%, and we eliminated, this was what set some people's hair on fire. We eliminated the essentially the trade-in waiver that you get. So if you trade in a vehicle, that comes off the top of what you pay for the tax. So if you're buying a $30,000 vehicle and you trade in a $10,000 car on top of that, instead of paying the excise tax on the $30,000 price tag, you're paying the excise tax on the $20,000 after the trade-in. And so we eliminated that, which I think on average, could be estimated at anywhere between like a $2,000 to $3,000 hit on an ordinary vehicle purchase. We did keep the exemption in place if you were trading in a car and buying an electric vehicle, again, to incentivize the shift to electric vehicles. But again, I think this was pretty reasonable. You can't really think of it as sort of a one-time cost, because it's usually you'd either roll it into the note of your car, or if you amortize it over a 10-year lifespan or 12-year lifespan of a vehicle, it comes out to about $200 a year. Again, I understand for some people that is a lot of money, and we didn't take any of these things lightly. But in the grand scheme of how we pay for transportation, and again, not just transit, but roads and bridges and all the things that we need as a functioning society, we felt like this was pretty reasonable. We also changed, we increased fees on vehicle registration. Some of these fees had not been increased in literally years. And then one of the things that we also did was we altered the registration fees for vehicles by weight, with a pretty easy way to think, if you're driving a heavier vehicle, it's more wear and tear on the roads, you should pay a little bit more if you're buying a bigger car. And then we also, and this is something that ultimately made it through, we added a surcharge for electric vehicles, which again, if you're funding your transportation system primarily through a gasoline tax, if you're driving an electric car, you don't pay the gas tax. And electric vehicles tend to be a lot heavier because of the batteries. And so not only are you not paying the gas tax, but you're probably wearing the roads a little bit more. So we felt like it was reasonable to put an electric vehicle surcharge on, an annual surcharge when you register your vehicle. So we put this package together, raised I think about $600 to $700 million a year, enough to basically eliminate the hole. I will say the caveat is this doesn't pay for things like the red line. So one of the other frustrating things, to be quite honest with you, I think that a lot of us felt about the position that the governor was in was that he likes to talk about all of these amazing things that we want to do. And the red line was a huge campaign promise of his when he was running, 2 years ago, and he had this great ribbon cutting in Baltimore, late last summer, to talk about we are going to embark on the reimagining of the red line. We want to build it. But if you take even the cheapest option for the red line, so they're sort of going through, I don't believe that they've picked the final iteration, but somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But a couple of different options are you could do essentially like a guided bus rapid transit line, you could do sort of a moderated light rail system, or you could do the full-on heavy rail, which was the original plan, almost 10 years ago when Larry Hogan canceled the $1 billion that we had gotten from the feds. The most expensive option is $8 billion total. That's the heavy rail. The cheapest option is the bus rapid transit line. That's I think about $4 billion. We are going to apply to the U.S. Department of Transportation for about half of that. They have, I think it's the New Start program, and the Secretary of Transportation has now publicly said on a number of different occasions, we are going to apply for essentially 49% of that. If you apply for 50, if you apply for less than 50%, you get like an extra bonus point on your application, so it makes it a little bit more likely that we might get it. So for all intents and purposes, round it to 50. So even if we go the cheapest route, which is a $4 billion project overall, that means the state's got to come up with $2 billion. What we did does not fund the $2 billion. It allows us to start funding the planning operations for it, but it doesn't fund the $2 billion. And when you apply for that grant to the feds, you have to show A, that you can fund the match, and B, you can't fund the match by like moving all of your other transportation money around. You have to show that your existing transportation systems are being appropriately funded, and not just funded like one time, that you're actually funding the maintenance, the sort of state of good repair money that allows the systems to operate. So that means the regular upgrades to your transit, the regular upgrades to your your vehicles and whatnot, or the regular maintenance on your roads, that they're not going to fall apart. So you can't just sort of do this on the fly. Like, that is legitimately new money that we have to put forward in some form or fashion to the feds before they'll even consider giving us what would be, in some instances, one of the largest New Start grants that the Department of Transportation has ever awarded. So again, that's sort of the context, that what we did here, we think fixes it, but still doesn't solve this problem of, if we want to build a red line, which we think is critical to the economic future of Baltimore, Baltimore City and the greater Baltimore region, we still have to come up with some other things. So we get to a point where, again, the governor really doesn't sort of want to engage. He says, I want this compromise. I want you all to work it out. The Senate kind of digs in. They started with the budget this year. They sent us a budget that had basically nothing in it for transportation. And again, one of the sort of conundrums, honestly, was, the Senate president represents Baltimore City. He represents the 46th district, which is sort of from the Port of Baltimore all the way around the Inner Harbor to South Baltimore and Brooklyn on the other side of the harbor. And one of the biggest impacts, frankly, of any jurisdiction, so the budget included a whole series of not only sort of immediate cuts and capital cuts, but then the governor can propose a BRFA, a Budget Reconciliation and Finance Act, that again sort of travels with the budget. And that is where the governor can propose policy changes. And in that BRFA document, he proposed pretty significant cuts to highway user revenue, to the locally operated transit systems. And again, Baltimore City was one of the biggest jurisdictions to get cut, because does anybody know who controls the roads in Baltimore City? Baltimore City. Kind of knew you might know that, Sean. So unlike in Baltimore City. So in Montgomery County, as most of us probably know, if you're on a road with a number, that is a state highway. And so that's a blessing and a curse in some ways. And there's been debates as to whether or not we should adopt sort of a Baltimore City model, but for better or for worse, if you're on a road like Connecticut Avenue or Georgia Avenue that has a corresponding number, it is controlled by the state. And the state, for the most part, pays for the upgrades and the maintenance in partnership usually with the county. And then every other road is paid for and controlled by the county. In Baltimore City, whenever time ago, they decided Baltimore City was going to control all of Baltimore City's roads. And so they get a tremendous amount of highway user revenue fees, because essentially it's the state saying, hey, we don't have to cover this, so we're going to give you the money and you're going to do the work for us. You could argue that's probably why Baltimore's roads are not in tremendously great shape in most places. But the cuts to highway user revenue fees would have cost Baltimore City like $70 to $100 million starting next year. And so what was a little bit perplexing to many of us was you would think the Senate president from Baltimore City would have a really concerted interest and a really vested interest in making sure that Baltimore City did not experience all these cuts. And that did not seem to be the case. So we have this sort of back and forth loggerheads with the Senate. And then, 2 weeks ago, we all know what happened, right? We wake up Tuesday morning and literally, I think it was something like out of a movie. My wife literally woke me up and said the Key Bridge is gone. And if you've read any of the interviews, that's basically how the governor was woken up at 2:30 in the morning when he was traveling. And so we're dealing with all of this with the backdrop of suddenly the bridge collapses in an unimaginable catastrophe. Which means not only do we now have to rebuild the bridge, it puts incredible additional stress and wear on Baltimore City's transit system and their roads. And in addition to the cost of the bridge itself and obviously all the cleanup that goes with it, which, thankfully, knock on wood at this point, seems to be covered by the feds, we're also now down another $50 to $60 million a year just in tolls, because that bridge generates on its own $50 to $60 million a year in tolls. That's something like almost 10% of the entire toll revenue that the state takes in. And for better or for worse, we all, you either love or hate tolls. Actually, I don't know anybody that loves it. I think we all hate tolls. That's, again, how we've chosen to pay for many of our transportation systems. And so now we're dealing with this transportation deficit that we had already and add another probably $250 to $300 million over the next 6 years, assuming we're able to rebuild the bridge in that period of time, which that is not a simple task. So all that happens. We still don't have a budget. We still don't have an agreement on transportation. And again, that's why we got to a point where I think a lot of us were not making plans for today or tomorrow or later this week, thinking, you know what, we might be here a little while longer. But all that's to say, we came to an agreement with the Senate. It is not everything that we wanted, but it makes a significant down payment into fixing things. And so all told, we agreed to basically raise about $330 million in annual transportation revenue. Again, we're looking at a shortfall that was probably $600 to $700 million before we started thinking about massive new expansions. But this is a pretty good down payment, and essentially gets us away from the worst of the cuts. It doesn't solve like every capital transportation project that was cut, but frankly, one of the other things that we got from Larry Hogan on his way out was he basically went through with his Department of Transportation and agreed to fund every capital project in every jurisdiction in the state. A lot of them were road projects. A lot of them probably don't need to happen. And so again, this was Larry Hogan wanted to go out like beloved by everybody, like the savior to every jurisdiction in the state. And so we think MDOT is going to go back now this summer and probably reassess a lot of those. Some of them should be moved up in the queue. Some of them should be moved down. Some should probably be put on the back burner and held until further evaluation or new ideas come to the forefront. So how do we raise the $330 million? I'll go through this real quick. We talked about the electric vehicle surcharge. It's now $100 annually for non-zero emission plug-ins, $125 for zero emission vehicles. We revised the weight class issue. So that means that if you have a vehicle that's 3,500 pounds or less, you're going to pay $70 to $80 when it goes into effect per year for your registration. If you have a vehicle that's now over 3,700 pounds, you're going to pay $121 or eventually as much as $151 a year by 2026. So again, you buy it, you're using a heavier vehicle, more wear and tear on the road, you're going to pay a little bit more. Talked about that rideshare fee. That did make it through the full iteration of things. We upped the fines for road work zones. And obviously we know we had that terrible tragedy about a year ago up in Baltimore County where six workers were killed by, I think the people were going almost 110 or 120 miles an hour. And that's actually been a huge priority for the Lieutenant Governor. Our Montgomery County zone, Aruna Miller, she led the task force and work group that was really looking into that. There's a new revenue on electric charging stations, and then we increased the car dealer processing fee, another $300 up to about $800. The one thing that did not get changed that I think some of us were disappointed on, and this was actually Delegate Chair Corman had a bill, and then it was incorporated into the House BRFA that we passed, would have been to, essentially put in place some variable rate tolling and look at taking essentially toll money out of, or essentially being reimbursed for costs for the intercounty connector through the tolls, which would have essentially required MDTA to figure out a better tolling structure. That ultimately was a bridge too far, no pun intended, for the Senate. But again, I think a source of frustration for us, because even if we do nothing, if the legislature takes no actions, tolls have to go up in another 2 years because again, Larry Hogan's cuts mean we do not have enough money to just pay for the debt service on the toll facilities themselves, on the things like the tunnels, the roads that are tolled, like the ICC or our state bridges. So again, absent us doing anything, tolls will have to go up automatically because MDTA, which has a separate bonding authority, will have to make sure they are raising enough revenue to satisfy their bondholders. So our thought was, you know what? Rather than just having this go up automatically and people getting upset with us anyway, let's do this in a responsible way that actually raises some revenue, that is reflective of the needs that we have as a state. And by way of example, and again, I am not poo-pooing this. If you live on the Eastern Shore or you live in and around Anne Arundel County and you have to commute across the Bay Bridge on a regular basis, this is a hit to your bottom line, right? We thought long and hard and very constructively about what this means for the state of Maryland and our residents. But if you travel the Bay Bridge, it's something like, I think, $3 a trip. If you travel the Bay Bridge in Virginia, it's like $12.50. So it's not as if we were doing something that was radically out of control compared to our local jurisdictions. And if any of you who have driven, we went to and if any of you have gone, we had family that was in town for a hockey tournament in Lorton, and we drove out there, and literally there was no way to get to Lorton without paying a toll, any time of the day. Like whether you're driving on, if you drive on the highway, you have to pay a toll. It's something like, I think almost $12 one way on a Saturday morning in Northern Virginia. And the only way you could avoid it was by spending 30 extra minutes on the road going through back roads and local roads. So that is what Virginia has chosen to do, right? We always like to compare ourselves to jurisdictions. And so, again, this is not perfect, but it's a down payment. The other thing we did was we got a very firm public commitment from the Senate President, from President Ferguson, to say that the Train Commission, which originally had a two-year window or a 2-year commission, and frankly, our BRFA said, look, we solved this problem. We kind of know what the solutions are. It's not a big mystery. We know how to raise revenue. We know the things that we can do in our transportation system that can bring us in new money. So we kind of said, doesn't need to meet anymore. So we got an agreement from the Senate President that this year, going into next session, in the 2025 session, there is a firm commitment from the Senate to publicly acknowledge we have not solved the problem. We have begun to fill the hole, but we haven't filled the entire thing. And we will spend the next year really putting pen to paper and coming to an agreement on serious revenue enhancements to pay for transportation. So he has said that publicly. He put out a joint statement with Speaker Jones, and the governor has sort of acknowledged we got to fix this. He again won't take a position on revenues, but he is supportive of the work that the General Assembly has done, and his sort of first year and a half in office has very much been, if the General Assembly comes to an agreement, I'm not going to block it. He's not necessarily gonna play a role in negotiating it, but he'll be a part of it. I will say his Department of Transportation, and Paul Wiedefeld, who's the secretary, have been amazing allies, and I think have been just wonderful partners in trying to come up with creative solutions. It's nice that a lot of the people, frankly, that I think many of us worked with as advocates when we were working on legislation during the last term of Hogan's governorship, are now senior folks in the administration. So like the person who was kind of my partner in crime on writing a lot of the Mark Rail legislation is now a senior official within MDOT. And those people did not go to MDOT to just cut everything, right? They went to advance really important projects for our region. And so, I'm really hopeful that next year we will be in an even better place. And again, we use this money to restore, the highway user revenue fees. We use this money to restore the lots. We use this money to make sure that state of good repair funding is there. Because you could argue we have a pretty substantial backlog just in making sure that the systems we have right now are working appropriately and working well, especially up in Baltimore. Obviously, one of the bright spots in the governor's budget, even before these cuts were restored, was a commitment on from him to make sure that Metro is fully funded. So we haven't even talked about the huge budget deficit that Metro faces, and that is through issues really that are not Metro's fault, right? We have incredible levels of inflation, obviously, over the last couple of years. And that inflation means their projects cost more, their labor agreements cost more. And then to the credit of Metro, during the pandemic, when Metro was getting funding from the federal government, Metro was given essentially like a regular increase a year, an annual regular increase. They gave that back essentially to the state of Maryland. They said, look, we know that you all are experiencing tough budget times. We have federal dollars. We're going to be okay with this federal money. You can keep the extra money that you were supposed to give us. But what that did was, because that increase was supposed to grow regularly, it meant that the baseline is now lower than it should have been. And so Metro is getting less money guaranteed from the jurisdictions, plus the federal money ran out, plus inflation ran out, plus, we've never really created as a region a sustainable funding mechanism for Metro, because obviously you've got an agreement from District of Columbia, Maryland, Virginia, and then the federal government has a role on the board and funds. I think it's $150 million a year, give or take, for Metro's operating budget. And so what the governor did was, so Metro had said to us we're about $750 million short, and Randy Clark, the general manager, had sort of presented kind of the doomsday budget that said, all right, if we're $750 million short, we're going to basically take all of our capital money, shift it into operating, and then we'll just cut a whole bunch of stuff. And that creates a sort of, I think he calls it the death spiral, right? You cut service, you increase, wait times, fewer people ride, you have to cut more service, and so on. But they said, look, we need $750 million. So give or take, that's about $250 per jurisdiction, plus whatever we might be able to get from the federal government. So the governor, to his credit again, for the next 2 years, this coming year and the year after, he put $150 million in additional funding in. And then after those years, put $250 million in essentially in perpetuity. So that was actually one of the bright spots. And it created, to be honest with you, a little bit of, I think, frustration among some of our colleagues in Baltimore City who said, well, look, Montgomery County is getting, like the DC region is getting all this money from Metro, plus some other things. Meanwhile, Baltimore City is looking at a $100 million shortfall in our highway user revenue fees, and you're making all these cuts to the MTA. Just part of the reason, again, we're like, this isn't about one region or another, it's about how we fix the overall problem. But even with this $150 million to Metro, it's still going to be, Metro's still going to have a shortfall. So Metro is going to, it seems like they're probably going to raise fares by about 12.5%, which sounds like a lot, and it's certainly not a small number, but it is apparently the inflation adjustment of the last time Metro raised fares. So there is at least logic to it. But as we've said to folks, well, DC region's getting all this money. Well, yeah, but it still means my constituents, you all, are going to have to, each one of us is going to have to pay more when we ride the Metro. It also means that Metro is going to have to defer some of its capital needs to bring money over onto the operating side. And again, that's dependent on, it looked like Virginia had an agreement, and now I think after the stadium deal fell apart, it looks like Governor Youngkin has decided to blow up any working relationship he had with the Democratic majority in their General Assembly, and it now looks like he might veto the budget. Oh, all right. Well, actually, that was my fault. I wanted Ben, but they're in the process of finalizing their budget, give or take, and hopefully Ben can share more on that. And it looks like DC has put a substantial amount of money in as well. So the sort of worst things for Metro have been put off, and then there's a work group among the Metropolitan Council of Governments, MCOG, that is looking at sort of a holistic fix to Metro's budget that I think will be a joint. We'll all kind of leap off the cliff together between DC, Maryland, Virginia, and hopefully a new setup from the federal government. One of the examples I'll give you is obviously a huge number of federal workers take Metro regularly, or they did pre-pandemic. And so without those folks returning to work 5 days a week, which seems like that probably will never happen. I think the 5 days in the office is probably something from the pandemic that will never return fully. There's been talk about saying, well, if your employees aren't going to come in every day, then they don't need to get those Metro benefits. Why don't you just use that money and essentially give it directly to Metro to subsidize it? So there's conversations I think that our federal delegation is having with the White House and the administration and the U.S. Department of Transportation and Metro on that. And so, that's sort of another issue. But again, you can't talk about the transportation budget without talking about Metro's funding situation, which, while is obviously critical to the DC region, thousands of people from other parts of the state commute to the DC region. They drive to Metro stations like New Carrollton, and other sort of end of the line stations and then come in. So, you know, it's like, I think the third largest jurisdiction in terms of ridership is actually Anne Arundel County. Again, there's no station in Anne Arundel County, but a lot of the federal workforce lives in Anne Arundel County, and you know, you don't want to drive all the way from, you know, Crofton into downtown DC. You drive to New Carrollton or wherever it is, and you take the metro in, and that's how you finish your commute. So the metro is really important to the entirety of Maryland. There's a lot of people who take MARC from the Baltimore region and then finish their commute on metro when they come into DC. So that's the budget, which again, I know is a lot, and I feel like I've been talking for a while. But the budget, there was nothing that we could do on transportation this session that was not influenced by what was going on with the budget. And I think for a lot of us, we did not put in sort of like big, bold new bills to anything related to transportation, because until we figured out how to fund what we already have and the kind of plans and ideas that are currently in the works, there's no sense in talking about big new expansions. And so the legislation that the Transit Caucus really focused on and the priority bills, I don't want to call them small potatoes because a lot of them are really important, but they're small potatoes in the sense of like there was no, we were going to create like a massive new expansion of the MARC system, or we're going to radically reimagine, you know, bus transit. But I do want to point out just a couple of things, and then I will stop. So a couple of the bills that that did pass and that the Transit Caucus focused on. One was House Bill 344, and I can send this list around later. Was a bill from Julie Polakovich-Carr, who represents Rockville, and Jeff Waldstreicher to create a Vision Zero Advisory Commission. That passed and will be established within MDOT to advise them on reaching their Vision Zero goals. There was a bill from Delegate Mark Edelson, Corey McCrae, to look at the mobility paratransit system within MTA, which for those of you who had followed, has been an absolute nightmare. It's even worse than the paratransit that we have in this region with Metro, which is great in comparison. Delegate Corman and Senator Feldman had a bill, the Maryland Metro Funding Act, which was not a super sexy bill, but was critically important. Essentially, what this bill did was address the cap that we put in place on Metro's operating funding, which was not allowed to grow more than 3% a year on the agreement that we had back in 2018. And so in order to be able to put that extra funding in that the governor put in his budget, we had to change the agreement that we had with the legislation that governs the agreement that we have with Metro. So that was really important. Another local bill, this is statewide, but was really driven locally. Many of you know Sarah Langenkamp, who was a cyclist who was killed in Bethesda. So Delegate Love and Senator Kelly in District 16 had a bill that dramatically increased the fines and the penalties for killing a cyclist, basically, because the driver who was responsible for Sarah's death, I think, got probation and a slap on the wrist. And so this updates that. That bill passed unanimously. Let's see what else. This was another big one. This was a bill from Delegate Robin Lewis up in Baltimore City, who many of you know is I think the only member of the General Assembly that does not have a car. She's fully transit dependent and is a wonderful friend of this club and just a wonderful part of our organization, the Transit Caucus, and a dear friend. And actually, Senator Kelly was her cross-file, and this was a bill to allow essentially automated enforcement cameras on buses to enforce dedicated bus lanes for NTA, primarily in Baltimore City. But this is a big deal. This is something that's done in a number of other jurisdictions around the country, and she's been working on this for 3 or 4 years, I think. So that's probably the biggest policy bill, I think, that passed in relations to improving transit, particularly in Baltimore City. We talked about the registration fee bill. That was actually Robin Lewis's bill that got incorporated into the BRFA. Delegate Corman, with the chair of the Budget and Tax Committee, had a bill around the toll process. That ultimately didn't go through, but I think it's probably something we'll pass next year. Delegate Corman had the bill that created the Uber Lyft fee. There was also another fee in there, which frankly, I think to our Senate colleagues was a bridge too far, but for many of us, and actually had talked a lot about this in the fall and got fairly reasonable responses to it, was actually to put a fee on Amazon deliveries or delivery services, which I think when you think about it, a lot of folks said, you know what, this actually makes sense, right? If I'm going to order my groceries or I'm going to order the things that 10 years ago I would have gotten in the car and purchased on my own, if I'm going to drive to Target or I'm going to drive to Bed Bath & Beyond or Costco to get these things, I'm going to use gas. I'm going to put wear and tear on my car. If now I'm just ordering everything through Amazon or I'm ordering everything through Instacart and it's being delivered to my door, those companies are not paying fees essentially to use the roads. And so it would have been a nominal I don't know, 25 or 50 cents. And we were just in discussions of, do you do it on orders over a certain amount? So it's not on every single thing. Do you do sort of a flat rate? Again, we tried to make these things very clear and tie them to reasonable policies. We're not just saying, oh yeah, let's, randomly increase taxes on, X, Y, or Z thing by 4%. And so ultimately that did not make it in, but I think it's something we may discuss going forward. But again, that was a little bit of too far for the Senate. Delegate Edelson did sort of the second half of a bill that I passed last year. So the locally operated transit system program that I've talked about, which again gives a percentage of funding to basically every jurisdiction in the state. In Montgomery County, it pays for ride-on, but in Queens Anne County or Dorchester County, it pays for senior ride share or Meals on Wheels or maybe local circulator bus routes in rural jurisdictions. So that program had been sort of operating off book. There was no statute that created it. And MDOT every year basically just gave whatever amount of money they wanted. So last year, I put in a bill that would have formalized the formula because what happened was all of these jurisdictions got money from the feds during COVID to keep these systems going. And so MDOT said, well, you're getting federal money, so you don't need our money anymore. Well, last year that money started to run out and counties were freaking out, rightfully so. And so last year, half of my bill passed, which was to just even codify the program in existence so that MDOT couldn't ignore it. And then this year, Delegate Edelson had a bill that essentially locked the funding level where it's been funded at for the last couple of years. And MDOT has told us they are working on an updated formula. But this at least says you can't go below what the expectation of funding has been for the last 4 or 5 years. And then probably the biggest disappointment literally died on sine die. It was on third reader in the Senate and got special ordered because the Senate just ran out of time, was a bill that Delegate Edelson and Senator Lamb did called the Transportation and Climate Alignment Act, which is a fancy name for a bill that would have essentially required MDOT to take into account climate impacts and issues with carbon usage and fossil fuel usage when looking at road projects. And the bill underwent a lot of changes that made it a lot more reasonable to implement. And again, literally died, I think at like 10:30, got special ordered last night, and they just ran out of time in the Senate. So I imagine that bill will be back next year. And I think that was it. I'm gonna pause on the housing. If anybody has questions on that, I'm happy to talk about it. But we made just the one thing I will say is it's incredible when we look at sort of the totality of bills that we pass. And this was a huge priority of the governor in an area where, to his credit, he really did show a lot of leadership. He put in three priority bills from the governor, from the administration on housing. A number of our colleagues put in bills, frankly, driven a lot by Montgomery County members. Delegate Stewart, who represents Aspen Hill in District 19, is the subcommittee chair and serves on the Environment and Transportation Committee and had a number of them. Delegate Polakovich-Carr had a bill. So this really was sort of, depending on who you ask, the session of housing, and I think almost every major housing bill that was put in passed, including a bill from the governor to further enhance protections for renters. So it's really significant. So if anybody has questions on that, I'm happy to go through it. I'm not as familiar with those bills because I don't serve on those committees, but suffice it to say, I think many of you would be pretty happy with the direction that we're moving as a state. I know that was a lot. It's a busy session, so happy to take questions, and I'm in no rush to get out of here. So,
yeah. Let me just add what I read this afternoon. I had to look in a lot of places. What they did in Virginia is that Youngkin did not veto the whole budget, but he submitted a whole lot of amendments.
yes,
And one of the amendments was to cut the state's contribution to Metro from 149 million to 133 million. And he said something to the effect of the counties can make up for it. And there's already a angry letter from Fairfax County.
Yeah. Thank you. I was gonna say I saw the headline and the blurb. I didn't get a chance to dig into it. I'm still digesting our stuff, but I think most of you probably know one of the major differences between Virginia and Maryland in terms of our contributions to Metro is our contribution from Metro comes just from the MDOT and state budget. In Virginia, there is a state contribution, obviously, that Ben mentioned, but a lot of most of Virginia's contribution comes from the local jurisdictions that have Metro, that are served by Metro. So it looks like Virginia contributes a whole bunch, but it's actually very small pots of money from a lot of different jurisdictions. So they have their own challenges, which, again, makes it for interesting negotiations because in Maryland, we just have to get the General Assembly to agree with the governor. In Virginia, you've got to get the governor, the General Assembly, and then all the local jurisdictions that have their own politics and local issues at play to come to an agreement. So again, the joys of having a system that spans 3 jurisdictions and three different types of governance. So yeah, in the back.
Thanks, Jared, for the fire hose. It was, it feels like a fire hose, like drinking from a fire hose here. And on that point, I really think I think we all deserve a second round with you because this is just too much, and we are the people that you and fellow delegates, hardworking delegates, are supposed to take direction from, and we can't give it to you with a presentation as overwhelmed as this one is. And it's not your fault. It's the way the system is working.
Yeah.
And but I just put that out that we need a second round with you.
Well, I was going to say, and you will probably get, the master of this is obviously, and we're really lucky that he's from Montgomery County, and not only has our interests close at heart, but is now in a position to do this statewide. Now Chair Corman, who represents Bethesda, is took the baton from Kumar Barve, and this was his first year as chair of the Environment and Transportation Committee, and worked, really was the right hand of the speaker as well as the appropriations chair and the chair of the Ways and Means Committee that deals with taxes on trying to fix a lot of these issues. And so, I think any number of us would be happy to come back at a later point. We obviously are still kind of digesting what this looks like. We don't fully know the impact of the loss of the bridge on things going forward. Some of the preliminary numbers show that the usage of Baltimore City's transit, the MTA system, is up like 10 or 15%, even in just a couple of short weeks from the collapse. So I think as the Train Commission continues to do more work, as we sort of figure out things going forward, a lot of you were so wonderful in making sure that there was local advocacy on Metro, which made a huge difference. And we were hearing from our business community, our civic community in Montgomery County and Prince George's that we could then take back to the state, or advocacy that was taken to Annapolis this year. We're not done, again, as we've said. So we need to figure out how we hold the Senate President to his promise, and that all of our colleagues who represent the other chamber, when we go back next year, we essentially finish the job. That this isn't something that is one time and one time only. And obviously, you can't divorce the conversation that we're having from politics. And this is a year where I think we're going to see a race in the state that, at least as long as I've been in Maryland, we've never really had a competitive general election for a U.S. Senate seat. And Larry Hogan obviously is running for the U.S. Senate. And so, when, by way of example, when, the most recent issues with the Purple Line came to light, that it's going to cost a little bit more, it was going to take a little bit longer, which I think a lot of us knew was coming. We just didn't know how much and how long. I got a bunch of angry emails, and I ran into some folks at events, and I said, you know what? This is on Larry Hogan, right? Like, he left MDOT in a state that could not manage the contract. He made promises when the contractor left before the new vendor came on, and when the new vendor got in, those promises were not kept. And so I said to people, you know what? Ordinarily, once the governor leaves office, you can't really hold him accountable. Well, you can, right? He is on the ballot. Assuming he wins the Republican nomination, he will be on the ballot in November to represent us in the United States Senate. And so if folks want to hold him accountable for these issues, they can. But that is a story that we will need you all to tell. Obviously, we don't know who the Democratic nominee is going to be quite yet, but I would venture to say either of them, it's either going to be County Executive Alsor-Brooks or Congressman Trone. And I will say County Executive Alsor-Brooks has been a huge champion of transit-oriented development. The new Carrollton Metro, MARC, and Amtrak station is probably the best example, perhaps on the East Coast recently, of transit-oriented development. You all will have to tell that story to voters, and I know this organization does a wonderful job of that come election time, but we will have to tell that story to voters, a lot in Montgomery County, who seem to think Larry Hogan was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And Larry Hogan as governor may be very different than Larry Hogan in the United States Senate. Right.
Jared, the question I want to ask you was about the Train Commission and your efforts to fix the budget.
Yeah.
It would seem that if you're taxing or giving fees for heavier weight vehicles, logically, that people walking and using bicycles should be given a subsidy. And that can be done through e-bike purchase subsidies.
Yeah.
There are actual means of doing that. But my basic overall question is a policy question about the train commission and how we evaluate in a time of crisis transportation projects. I don't think it is a fair, balanced, equitable, or rational thing to cut here and cut there. I think that if we look over years and decades, we've overbuilt a road system that is inequitable, as well as unfinanceable. So we maybe ought to be funding more transit projects in this crisis and cutting projects that are already approved.
Well,
and so how can we get the train commission or some other body to look at a truly equitable and functional analysis of the direction we should be taking?
Yeah.
Because the decisions we made years ago about funding this and that and balancing interests from transit and roads, for instance, were made in an environment of financial feasibility. So that environment has changed, but we're still using the same.
Well, let me answer your question, because I know there's probably some other folks that want to weigh in as well. So you're absolutely right. So there's a couple of things I want to say. So one, the members of the train commission are all public. There are appointees from the House of Delegates, appointees from the Senate, a number of folks from environmental communities, from different transit advocacy groups, from business community. I mean, it's literally like a full cross section to the credit of the group of every entity in the state that is influenced by transportation and representation on there. And so those are all public. You can weigh in, and obviously I don't think they've started their meeting schedule again yet, but you can watch all those. You can influence the folks. Delegate Corman, for example, is on the commission. And so, that's certainly something. But obviously, whatever the train commission recommends, at the end of the day, it is the General Assembly and the governor that will have to take those recommendations and turn them into actual legislation and policy. And so continuing to advocate to folks like me and my colleagues in the Senate is a really wonderful way to do that. There was a bill, and I cannot for the life of me remember who introduced it. There wasn't an e-bike rebate program that was put forward. Obviously, again, part of the struggle that we have, frankly, with our colleagues in the Senate is we need to raise enough revenue, or we need to figure out new funding sources to fill the gap that we have. Alone, talking about new expansions of things. Again, I think there is a much stronger appetite for that in the House than there is in the Senate. So while obviously you all are not represented by anybody outside of Montgomery County, but you may have friends and relatives, I would have to say to you that I think the best place to put your advocacy would be in the Senate this coming year, because the House, we're already on record in raising at least $600 to $700 million. And that's not to mention we did two other revenue raises that go towards other priorities in the general fund. We did combined reporting, which changes the way that essentially brings Maryland in line with 30 other states that do not allow companies to essentially almost cut off their other subsidiaries when looking at their overall taxation rate. And then we also, love it or hate it, we passed what would create a referendum for internet gambling that would have, if it had passed, would have gone to the ballot this year to the voters. But that, give or take, would have created a whole new source of revenue. And again, we had other suggestions on tolling and other fees that we all thought were pretty reasonable. It was the Senate, frankly, that did not have to take that vote. And so in our caucus, I want to say, I don't remember the exact vote, it was at least 90 to 95 folks who voted in favor of it. That's a much easier vote for us to take again next year when you've already done that, right? If there was going to be political ramifications, we would hear about it already. Our Senate colleagues have not had to. And so for them, it's going to be harder to do. But, and then to your last point, again, I think that's an easy sell to many of us. So the scheme that is in the budget this year was not just all all right, you have to take the money that we're giving you, MDOT, and essentially every program that was already in the capital transportation plan. There's essentially a series of evaluations that they have to go through, but we wanted to give MDOT the flexibility to say, you are the experts here. We know the governor's priorities. We know the people that the governor brought in. And we want them to be able to take essentially a fine-tooth comb and a lens to these projects and say, you know what? Like a Montgomery Hills is a beneficial project that benefits everybody. It benefits road users, it benefits pedestrians, it benefits bikers, it benefits transit users because of the proximity to all the stations. That is a road project that I think many of us could be proud of. If it was just we're going to blow up Georgia Avenue and add extra lanes in each direction to make it easier to get on Beltway, I think we'd be saying something different. Obviously, we haven't really talked about the 495 American Legion Bridge 270 plan. That is, again, I think candidly, folks from MDOT in the room, they would tell you they probably don't know what they're going to do, and that they are going to have to go back to the drawing board and figure this out. But we want to give them some flexibility, but they know the kind of pieces that go into projects like that the General Assembly wants to prioritize, and we know that's where the governor is too. So you're right. But in terms of sort of bigger dramatic changes, none of us from Montgomery County, unfortunately, are kings in terms of this process. And so we have to take the whole totality of the legislature into account. And again, I think that's where advocacy in the Senate will probably be helpful. We'll go in the back and then up front, and when we want to wrap up here. We'll take a few more. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Think about the Key Bridge in Baltimore. Who's going to pay for the damage? Will the shipping company pay for it, maybe through their insurance?
Yeah, that is a good question, and one that I think, frankly, we're not gonna have an answer to for probably 4 or 5 years. So, I mean, you all probably saw the president a couple of different occasions has said he wants the full cost of the bridge to be covered by the federal government. Obviously, his power of the purse is limited by what Congress wants to do and what Congress chooses to do. Obviously, the liability issue is something that's going to have to be litigated. The company that owns the Dolly, the ship that hit the bridge, has already invoked merchant commerce, ocean commerce law from like the 1850s that essentially limits the liability. If a company was not directly at fault, it limits the liability of the company to no more than the value of the ship. So it was used during the Titanic. There have been a couple of really interesting articles about it. Also, my understanding of the way that shipping insurance works and maritime insurance is that there are often these sort of pooled plans so that it's not one company in and of itself that is responsible for it. All of the shipping companies sort of go in, which also means that you have more people attempting to litigate it. But the liability law does mean that litigation has to be centered in the state of Maryland, which makes it a little bit easier. I am not by any stretch a maritime law expert, but from what I've read, it seems like this may be litigated for the next 3 or 4 years, which we're not going to wait. So either the feds will pay for it, and then we will then reimburse the feds for whatever we get. We did pass a bill literally yesterday called the Port Act that creates a whole series of essentially like aids and supports to businesses impacted by the port, and also gives the governor the authority to take money out of the rainy day fund for certain expenditures. And it does say anything that we recoup has to pay back the trust fund, has to pay back the rainy day fund. And obviously, if we get ultimately an insurance payoff, that money would go back to the federal government, obviously, for any costs that they gave to us. Yep. Yeah. Absolutely.
There's an excellent video by DMV Local Legal that you can look up that breaks down all this legal yada yada about who's going to probably end up picking up the tab for this.
All right, I'm going to list these out in rapid fire. So, 1, how will the Francis Key collapse impact Bay Bridge funding? Because after all, there was this proposal to put a third span of the Bay Bridge near where the current one is. And how can we encourage there to be some transit development on these future bridges, like having a rail link? I'm sorry, rail link. And then also, well, it's that one first.
Yeah. So, again, I think the hope is that, again, it's only 2 weeks in. The hope is that the money we're getting from the federal government and sort of some of the emergency funds that are coming out of the rainy day fund will pay for in the near term the cost of the Francis Scott of the bridge replacement. And then, you know, they're actually, to Andy Harris's credit, and I don't say this very often, obviously he is the only Republican in our House delegation, but he's a senior member of the House Appropriations Committee. So the governor was on Capitol Hill this morning with the entirety of the Maryland congressional delegation. So Van Hollen and Cardin are 7 Democrats, and then Andy Harris. And Andy Harris publicly said this is a bipartisan priority of the Maryland delegation to make sure that the state is made whole. He doesn't usually say that. I mean, literally voted for an education budget earlier this year that would have like decimated the counties that he represents. So that was really nice to hear. So I think in probably a lot of people's minds, the bridge funding is sort of like a separate pot of money. Obviously, it does put some pressure. Again, we talked about the tolls on the rest of the trust fund, but it's not as great. If we're able to figure out the other trust fund issues, it should allow things like potentially, and it's by no means a done deal. I mean, again, I can only keep my fingers on the pulse of so many issues. That is a fight between Anne Arundel County and Queen Anne's County in terms of what's going on with the Bay Bridge. But you and I have talked about this before. I think it would be wonderful to put a light rail or some sort of rail system right down Route 50 across the bridge, run it to Easton. But those jurisdictions are going to have to want that because, frankly, while I would love to put it on there, if those jurisdictions decide they don't want it, we have plenty of transit projects in the Montgomery County region and the Capital Region that I would be more than happy to put the money into. And I did mention one of the other bills that was a relatively small bill in the grand scheme of things, but so 2 years ago, working in concert, we were able to get essentially $27 million in dedicated funding for bus rapid transit in Montgomery County. And we passed a bill this year. That money was contingent on bonds being floated for stadium improvements, and the timeline for that has changed. So we passed a bill this year that said we're guaranteed that money, whether the bonds are floated at this date or later on. So that's a big deal for certainty for Montgomery County to be able to build our BRT systems. Small bill, but really critically important to our county. And I think you had one more.
Well,
Okay. Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, this is about revenues from transit, and actually, no, I'll ask you this one another time. But this I think the more important one though that should be in front of everybody here is how these cuts affect accessible transit programs for individuals with disabilities, like Metro Access and other state-funded stuff within Maryland. Because right now, and in other places where there needs to be more expanded accessible transit access for individuals with disabilities, how will these cuts be impacted, and how do we ensure that those, like I can't drive, I have a vision impairment. How do we ensure that those who don't have the option of getting around in a private car when these cuts are made, are still able to get around?
Yeah. Well, and Jake, you make a really good point because I didn't even mention this. So one of the other frustrating pieces of the original proposal from the governor back in December was they were across the board cuts, and so I think it was 8% basically from the entirety of every operating mode within MDOT. And to exactly your point, I think to a lot of us it was like, well, what's the logic of that? Obviously, it's really simple to just say we have deficit of X and we have a budget of Y, and so in order to balance the two of them, we're just going to figure out what the gap is and divide it equally. But that leaves out, as you're saying, the really important policy priorities that for some communities, those commuter bus routes may be an absolute vital link to any types of jobs. Whereas, in other places, there may be a little bit more that you can massage in the airport administration, right? That maybe BWI can pick up the cost somewhere else, or you can shift around capital priorities in the MTA budget that you might not be able to elsewhere, or in the port budget. And so you're exactly right. I mean, so our hope is that we don't get to a point where we have to have these cuts. And what we really need to be talking about is expansion. I mean, Montgomery County has done an amazing job with Ride-On, but it's still not good enough. Obviously, Metro, is still emerging from the pandemic. It seems like the trends are moving in the right direction, but we really need to think about, how do our transit systems respond to a completely new normal when it comes to commuting and work. And the MARC system, again, is a perfect example. When you just look at pure MARC ridership, it's down, but that's because people are not commuting in the same patterns. But when you look at MARC ridership on the weekends or other destinations, it's really different. And so maybe you could have we believe you would have a tremendous surge in ridership if the MARC system no longer was a dedicated commuter system, because it's a system that doesn't meet the needs of the workforce anymore. But in order to do that, it requires more money. You know, it's, if you, to quote, you know, the great Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. But you have to build it, and you have to have the funding to be able to do that. So you're exactly right. And obviously for those of us representing the DC region, I mean, you want to talk about a line in the sand, Metro has to be funded. And, you know, Montgomery County is the largest jurisdiction in the state. We are the economic engine of the state. You know, one of my top priorities, and we had another bill that got us dedicated operating funding. This was on the normal budget, or the operating budget, was for the Institute for Health Computing in North Bethesda, which has the potential to become one of the largest economic growth opportunities for our state. We're hoping to become essentially the Silicon Valley for health computing. And so this is a now burgeoning partnership between University of Maryland, University of Maryland Baltimore, University of, which is all of our grad programs, the med school, the University of Maryland Medical System, which has about 2 million patients across the state, and the FDA, the NIH are already co-locating there. We have a number of corporate partners. And so we got $6 million eventually in dedicated operating funding. It's a ramp up over the next 4 years to allow that to grow, and that hopefully will anchor a new development at a second metro entrance in North Bethesda, which is, if you're going up Rockville Pike, it's the sort of big grassy 16-acre lot that's right across from Pike and Rose. And so again, we know Metro is the economic engine and the backbone of economic growth in our region. And so we will fight to the death, which we hope is not necessary, to make sure that we get the support we need to not only continue Metro in its current form, but to be able to grow it, particularly the bus system, which we know is so important to folks with disabilities and low-income folks across the community.
Let's do one more. Yeah. Any more from you guys?
Yeah. So hey, Gerald, how are you?
Good to see you.
Yeah,
Congratulations on your new role.
Oh, thank you. Likewise, it's good to see you around. So as Jake Goodman mentioned, the question about the situation for the Metro cut is, this could be putting the big consequences for people with disabilities, especially if there's a certain cuts to the ride-on buses or pedestrian safety, because this is going to be a huge impact for the pedestrians, because we've seen a lot of pedestrian incidents across Montgomery County, but not just Montgomery County, but throughout the DMV region across state of Maryland, because is there particularly what you can do to support like the funded for the transportation, including the pedestrian safety? This may include for individual with disabilities in order for them to get through it.
No, thank you for your passion, and for again bringing the focus on those issues. I mean, so what is nice is, again, it's not perfect, but Metro's budget does not include service cuts as far as I know, and so it does include a fare increase, but they've also sort of changed the way they do fares, and I think some of the fare changes actually are a little bit more equitable or fair. Exactly, I was trying to figure out a way not to say fair again, but you know, Randy Clark, I think, has done a really good job of, you know, reimagining the system. So for example, you know, it's a little bit more equitable that you're being charged. You know, they changed the way they do distance charges. It's not just you get on, you know, one station and suddenly you're paying X amount. They do yeah. You know, they're doing peak, off-peak hour changes. There's more of a flat rate for the weekends to encourage people to use it during the weekends. So again, I do not believe the budget proposal under the scenario where one way or another Virginia puts their money in, DC puts its money in, and we know we now have Maryland's money, depending on what we get from the federal government, will not include fare increases. The one other piece of legislation that, frankly, I think we were a little frustrated didn't advance was a bill that was our county executive's top priority in Annapolis, which would have given essentially jurisdictions the ability to do variable tax rates. So obviously the authority for taxation is granted on local jurisdictions from the state of Maryland. So any sort of local tax changes that change the structure of the taxes, not necessarily the tax rates, have to be passed at the state level. And so one of the things that Virginia does that is very successful is they tax commercial property in certain districts at a different rate than they would residential property. The idea being, if you're building an office building and you want people to come, transit's really helpful. So you should probably pay a little bit more for a functioning transit system. We do not do that in Montgomery County. We fund our transportation infrastructure support through an impact tax, which is essentially a big upfront cost that a developer has to pay. And so, in a nutshell, I'm not an expert on local taxation, but in a nutshell, what this bill would give the county the authority to do is essentially eliminate the impact tax and move to a system where they say you're going to pay, commercial, if the residential property tax rate is like $1.20, and I'm just randomly pulling numbers out, in a certain area, that commercial property that office building may pay $1.40 or whatever, and that additional 20 cents is going to go to a dedicated transportation or infrastructure fund. Again, this is what they do in Northern Virginia, and will pay for things like bus rapid transit for contribution to Metro. And so my guess is, as COG figures out sort of a long-term sustainable approach, this is going to get more and more conversation in Annapolis, and we'll have to see. What we don't want, and I think what our local leaders are a little concerned with, is this bill we don't want the state to then turn around and say, okay, we don't have to fund anything because now Montgomery County and Prince George's will just, dramatically increase taxes on commercial property. It's still got to be a balance. But again, that kind of revenue approach would give Montgomery County revenue for BRT and other transportation solutions. And we think, again, one of the biggest differences between, our side of the river here in Maryland and Virginia is Virginia seems to be doing a better job of investing in infrastructure than we are. Unfortunately, a lot of their investments are in roads, but they're also building a lot of rail. So,
well, hey, let's give a round of applause. Someone's excellent. I can tell you used to be a teacher, but I got a PhD in state government. I used to work for state government. So great job. Thank you so much.
We miss you in Annapolis, but we're glad.
I do miss being there, but I'm glad we have you there. And great leaders like you. It's wonderful. You know your audience well, so it's great. A couple quick announcements. Next month's meeting will be on the third Tuesday because the second Tuesday is the primary. So
Go vote.
The third Tuesday.
Go vote, yeah.
It's going to be May 21st. We'll be here at the Civic Building, as far as I know. But it will be the third Tuesday. So look out for an email alert for the speaker. One other quick announcement. Speaking of Paul Wiedefeld and MDOT, ACT is doing some leafleting in support of a bus lane on Georgia Avenue during the upcoming Red Line shutdown. This summer, the Red Line is going to be closed north of Fort Totten for some Purple Line integration work at the Silver Spring Station. Pretty much all summer, probably Labor Day to Memorial Day, vice versa.
Yeah.
So that's gonna be a big impact. So we have a, I think because they can't turn the trains around in like a certain.
Yeah.
I think because Silver Spring has like a pocket track.
They're doing a bunch of Purple Line integration, and I think they're using it as an opportunity to do a lot of the track work on the Red Line. That sort of 2 for 1. And I will say, actually, I should have mentioned this. We are my office is working with MDOT to bring everybody together, local government, Purple Line partners, Metro, to make sure we're all on the same page. And we're hoping to have a meeting either next week or the week after. We know the county sent the letter, been paying attention to what you all have been asking for, so we want to bring all of those different ideas to MDOT and to our partners and push them. One of the other ideas that I think would be great would be free mark service or dramatically reduced mark service to incentivize folks. I think a lot of people don't realize, particularly in my neck of the woods in Kensington, that you can get from Kensington or Garrett Park to Union Station in literally like 15 minutes with 1 or 2 stops in between.
Those fares were comparable to
right.
Metro
fares.
Yep. Because currently, it seems like recent fare increases have been $1 across the board.
Yep.
Whether you're coming from Martinsburg or Kensington.
Right.
And that's 50% increase for Kensington to 16% for
Yep.
Martinsburg.
Yep.
So we'll be flying and asking for that dedicated lane. Those are, if you go to our website, actfortransit.org, we have a link there where you can kind of write to it yourself to the Paul Wiedefeld and Randy Clark of WMATA. So hopefully that happens.
And if you're interested in volunteering,
join Lev out there.
Let me know. I'll put you on a list.
Yeah. So please see Lev afterwards if you're interested. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. We hope to see you all next month. So thank you again, Delegate Solomon. It was great.